Okay, so just real quick, there's no real announcements. I do still need to add the curve points. Those are the 10 points to exam 3. So I will do those this week. And then obviously we have our exam 5 that is coming up tomorrow. And then just a reminder that if you haven't finished all of the Cogbooks materials, you can go back and finish ones from previous exams and still get full credit for it. And remember, if you just simply go through them, they will count for full credit for your grade. And if for some reason they don't, send me an email and I can contact Cogbooks to see what the problem is. I think there's also a link where you could contact them as well. So if we both contact them, it might get their attention more. Also, it might just take Cogbooks like an hour or so to actually recognize and upload the points once you have finished it. So sometimes it's immediate and sometimes it's not, depending probably how many people are using the software. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the group.
All right, so my question's in regards to the index cards of equations. Now, for the equations, is it only math equations or does it also include chemical equations?
My intention was to have it just include the math equations because you will have to do calculations and that way you can have them on there if you know how to use them. So the intention was just the math equations.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and just double check the announcement to see exactly what I wrote.
You might need to send another announcement because it wasn't clear on the announcement.
That's a good idea. Yeah, because I put some examples about the efficiency equations. Okay, but I did not specify that it was not the chemical compounds or chemical equations.
I'd like to piggyback off of that for a moment and say, like, for example, in the Jacquard's index of similarity, are we allowed to write what the variable means or just like the letter?
You can spell it out if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, because in the example I gave, I wrote out like the words consumption efficiency, so there's no reason you couldn't use the words. I just don't want full sentences, like the definition of the word within that equation, but you can write the full words out that are in that equation.
Okay.
In Cogbooks T21 for the activities for the carbon cycle, can you help me differentiate between assigning the one that produces the bicarbonate ion and then the one that produces carbonic acid? It's like two pictures of an ocean, and I just don't know how to differentiate there.
Sure, so let me share my screen real quick. These are good activities to go over together. Okay, can everybody see my screen with the images here?
Yes.
Okay, so the way that I kind of approach this is I use a few things to help me kind of remember them. I'm not a soil scientist or an elemental scientist using carbon necessarily. So for me, this isn't my specialty. But there are a few ways that I've done this, and if anybody has any other suggestions, I'm open to anybody's input. But so the way I kind of went through this is we'll just go through the entire activity if that's okay, because I can kind of show my thought process for each one of these that includes the ones that you were talking about.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay, so here's the production of organic carbon. So there's technically glucose, but we don't necessarily need to know that's glucose. It is helpful. And I will say too, a quick note is that this section does this is where the prerequisites for the course come in. So this is where having one of the prerequisites is general chemistry and the other one is general biology. So knowing, what chemical compounds are and how they kind of interact a little bit, there is some expected knowledge from this because Cogbooks does not have all the details for this section. So I just want to put that out there too. But if we go into this activity, we talk about the production of organic carbon. The way I think about this is production, primary producers. So this is the picture on the bottom left. This is a picture of some cells. So these are going to be very low level primary producer type production. And that's how I kind of remember that one. Consumption of organic carbon. So consumption, just eating, and organic being some food type. So that's going to, the picture here is this ape that's eating some type of fruit. And then decomposition, so that's just, of organic carbon, so it's organic, so it has to be some form of living material. So we have, a dead animal that is decomposing here, so that's kind of how I draw for the decomposition of organic carbon. And then these next ones, some of it is just for me remembering it and kind of thinking about what is happening in the description. So here you have circulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And what this picture on the top left is that's kind of the edge of the atmosphere where you have air currents going, where we have gas changing from space and then coming through the atmosphere and kind of cycling at that atmospheric level. That's where we get these circulation by going through those two layers of outer space and our atmosphere. And these are two gas molecules, so there's it's going to be all gas molecules up here. And this one is the circulation of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. The way that I like to remember this is that carbonic acid, most acids are technically a liquid. So this is going to be a gas and a liquid cycling. So then we have the atmosphere and water through waves, and those two cycling is how we get the cycle of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. And then the storage of calcium carbonate, I honestly don't have the greatest explanation for this. The way that I remember it is the bottom of the ocean is where sediment falls, and a lot of things are underneath the bottom of the ocean and are stored there. And there's a lot of calcium sediment in the ocean floor. So that's how I kind of remember this calcium, or the calcium carbonate storage. And you will see similar questions to this on the exam. So knowing what is going on in all of these pictures is going to be important. So if there's any other of these activities or pictures that anybody had questions about what's actually happening in them, or why something matches up, I'd be happy to talk about more of these activities as well.
Thanks for your help. I guess for number 4, I'm just looking over the topics and learning objectives. For
Sure.
number 4, can you go over, I guess, the key outcomes for adding each of those elements?
So number 4 says predict the effect of adding carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus to a component of the ecosystem on the fluxes of these elements to other components of the ecosystem. So the way that this is going to appear on the exam is going to be very much like the activities for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling. So when you sometimes have, let me Let me share my screen again. So can we see the cogbooks activity here too?
Yes.
Okay. So what number 4 is really getting at is when you have some of these chemical compounds, when you have what happens when you break down your organic carbon, what is going to be produced? You're going to get carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide right there, and then carbon dioxide. Or if you start off with carbon dioxide, how does it turn into this element over here, H2CO3 on the right? So that's all that really means there is it's like the second half of these activities where you actually have where you look at the chemical compounds and describe what is happening in there. How do we go from carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide? So what is, you know, the event that's potentially happening? And that can be the same for nitrogen or for phosphorus as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
So in the chat, someone asked about the possibility of keeping the exam open through Friday, October 6th, to assist with multiple finals and schedules. Without that can be done potentially on an individual.
Could you please? That would help out tremendously because there are a lot of us struggling. That would help out so much.
I understand the request, the problem of asking the day before the exam.
If office hours were held sooner, I would ask that too. So it can't be helped that it was brought up then.
Well, I mean, to some extent, it could be asked through an email. It's not the only form of communication. The problem is that grades are due on Monday, so truthfully, part of it is to allow the TA some time during the work week to get the exam graded.
The TAs haven't really been helpful throughout the exam period for the entire class. Throughout the course, they've been lagging on the grades. We shouldn't suffer because of that. This is not our only class, and we have a lot of pressures for a lot of our finals. It's not fair to us to have the TA grading affect us.
I agree with that comment, but are all your other classes going to move their final exams to a different date because the class requested? And generally the answer is no.
Our other classes allow us a window of 2 to 3 days to take the exams. No other class only has 1 day to take the exam, and that includes genetics.
I mean, that's a general statement. I understand your point, but that's not true because I know of other classes that don't have multiple days for their finals. I mean, I'm not going to get into a debate about
Not
it.
for the
It's true
biological
for-
sciences degree. Could you name them? That would be helpful.
Yes, for the BIO320, the conservation biology course does not do that. I'm not going to get into debate about it. I mean, this is not going to be useful for our time here.
I know, but
appreciate
this is
your
a serious
opinion and
concern
appreciate your
for
input.
all of the students in the class.
So when I said if people ask individually, I have been flexible. This is coming from the chat. I have been flexible with scheduling conflict, people being sick. So that it would have to be an excusable reason for it to be pushed.
So you would want us to email you a request?
But again, it would have to be a university approved reason, such as being sick.
Okay.
Okay, I was just going through the learning objectives again. I had to, I did have to rush a little bit this week because I'm moving, but number 7 is one that I can't answer myself right off the top of my head. Summarize which groups of animals and plants are most at threat of extinction from global change.
Sure. So this is referring generally to, I believe, this set of figures that we've seen. So it says summarize which groups of animals and plants are most at threat of extinction from global change. And this breaks it down with conifers being types of trees, and obviously bird, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, and fish. And then the different colors here just to indicate, based on the type of organism, if they're orange, that means that they have high levels of threat. If they're blue, that means they're near threatened, so there's some concern, but it's not as bad as actually being threatened. And then obviously least concern are animal populations that are doing relatively well. So if it just asks, we could ask some general questions here saying, which of these 6 groups do we think are of, least concern for loss of, least concern for extinction, and why? So what do we think would be, out of the 6, the least concerning?
Fish,
Sure, and why would we say that?
because it looks like there is 77.3%, which is the largest, and then only 18% is threatened versus 41.7 or 25.4, and near threatened is only 4.2% compared to.
Sorry, go, you finished? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's it. That's good. 4.2% near threatened. That's significantly smaller than the other pie wheels.
I'd say fish would be a good candidate for being one of the ones of least concern. What would be another good candidate for being of least concern?
Birds.
Yeah, birds. And that one we could maybe argue because they only have 13% that are threatened versus the 18%. So they have a similar amount that are in the threatened and near threatened, and the same amount basically they're of least concern. But overall, they might be of total less concern because only 13% are threatened versus the 18% here.
I had a question about the conservation services in T22. I don't really understand the difference between the regulating services and the supporting services. If you could clarify the difference between those two, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. So I think that brings up one of the learning objectives too. I don't think so. So, sorry, can you repeat which 2 you had questions about again?
The rating and reporting.
You say the regulating and the supporting?
Yes.
Okay. So regulating is defined as benefits of biodiversity that include climate regulation, flood control, and water purification. So it could be like wetlands would be a good example for water purification and regulating flood control. And then supporting services are things that benefits of biodiversity to allow ecosystems to exist, such as production, soil formation, and nutrient cycling. So regulating services are gonna be like physical areas, so being like a wetland would be the example, so it gets filtered physically through the wetland. Versus a supporting service is the actual service in that production then, so that would be. Because the example here they're using is primary production. So that would be more of life kind of forming in primary production, or soil formation where the soil builds up. And nutrient cycling is the physical process of nutrients going in being created through the cycling process. So they are very similar based on their definitions. But I would think it is regulating services. Because they're both a type of service. So no, that's a fair question.
I kind of thought of it like regulating services almost allow um the physical the physical state of ecosystems to exist, like controlling, like it says flood control, and then supporting services is simply allowing life to exist um and grow and thrive. I don't know if that helps at all.
I mean, it's definitely on par with what the definitions are saying here. So I think supporting services, to build off of what you were saying, is more supporting actual life. So it's going to be more like, that's talking about nutrients that are required for life. Primary production is a food source, versus regulating services are more physical processes. So if we have flood control, that is not necessary, for organisms to live. So it's not at the nutrient level, but it can destroy the habitat. So supporting services are vital to survival, and regulating services are not vital, but they could be helpful and prevent the ecosystem from being altered, like being damaged in a flood, for example.
Okay, that helps. It does seem like a very fine line, but that does help me understand the difference. Thank you. I was going to ask about Jacquard's index of similarity one more time. Are we going to be needing to calculate that? Because there wasn't an activity on that, I don't believe.
Yeah, and that I'll go ahead and tell you, no, you will not have to do the math calculations for it because it didn't have an activity. So
Okay,
do
just
you
know what it is.
Yeah, do understand what's the purpose of it, what goes into it, and how changing, part of that equation could potentially change the result and what that would mean.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
From the chat, now look, where's that from the Jacari index?
So we have to calculate it?
No, you will not have to actually do calculations for that one. Understanding it conceptually, like what it does, what a result of it could potentially mean, how to interpret it, that is what is going to be important.
Thank you.
Well,
I'm also just curious, are we still considering a curve for number 4, or is that out of the question?
I will have to go back and look at the class average for that, so it's not, I'll just say it hasn't been decided yet. It is a possibility, but it'll
Okay,
depend on
perfect.
the class average.
This is not about the exam exactly, but I can't remember. Do you know, will I have access to this cog book for this class after the class is complete?
No,
Okay.
they'll access to cog books, I believe, goes away at the deadline of the class. So I think through Friday, we'll have access.
Okay. Um, can you recommend any books that would be very similar that I would just be able to buy just to have? Maybe you could email me sometime.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that because they would be very similar to cog books. No, because that's not based off of any one book. I'll be honest, I
Mhm.
don't know exactly where the information comes from. There's some citations for images, but it feels that it was kind of piecemealed together by the course creators based on the topics in ecology that were to be covered in the course.
Okay.
Because if you look at a general ecology book, there's a lot more information than is covered in this course.
Okay, so maybe I should just search for general ecology textbooks.
Yeah, and there are some good ones. I can't remember exactly. I can see the cover page of one of them. It's a series, but I can't remember exactly what it's called offhand. But I can send out an email about that.
Okay. Yeah, just I mean, I like having stuff like that in my library, especially as I'm going into internships and stuff. So,
Sure, yeah, because a lot of times they're good reference books. Maybe not the
mhm.
best to read cover to cover because they cover so much. But
Yeah. All right, thank you.
What would we expect from the essay questions on exam 5 exactly? Like, which pages on the cog books should we focus on to excel on the essay questions?
and that's something that I can't explicitly give you like the pages to focus on. Um, without exactly necessarily giving the questions away, but let me, there are a few of the topics and learning objectives that would be important to pay attention to. So one of them that I'll ask to talk about it as a group is the last one, number 11. So number 11 says, describe the potential effects of reintroducing a keystone species into an ecosystem. Give an example from recent history and conclude whether the reintroduction increased or decreased biodiversity. So there was one example that cog books went over in a lot of detail. Does anybody remember what that example was of reintroduction?
Yep. About the wolves.
Yeah, so do you or other people want to kind of share about it? So what was the problem to start with?
I remember that it was talking about how the wolves were like hunting too many elk and like so they had to like get rid of the wolves, but then they realized that the wolves were actually going extinct in that region. And so they had to reintroduce the wolves to balance out the diversity of the prey versus the predator.
Yes, I agree with the second part of that, but it was not that the wolves were overhunting the elk. It was that the wolves were there originally, and then the farmers, ranchers, humans, we'll call it, didn't like wolves because they were a direct competitor with various functions that humans did, including ranching, farming, pets, hunting, and just general survival. Like wolves are capable of killing humans, so they were viewed as a threat. So humans in North America did a good job of getting rid of the wolves. And obviously that wasn't a great thing, because then it did have a kind of a cascade effect is the big theme here, right? Where we had what happened to the elk once the wolves were removed.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm asking that as an open-ended question to the group.
Oh,
Their behavior changed, right? They started going to specific areas to eat.
Yeah, exactly. Their behavior changed because the wolves are no longer there. So it's thought that the elk no longer had fear of a big predator. So they were able to move out of the forest area. And as someone mentioned in the chat, moving out of the forest area, they moved into the open, into the fields and by the riverbanks, and they ate lots of the vegetation that they normally didn't eat. And because they could spend so much time there due to the behavioral change, they removed a lot of that vegetation and prevented willows from growing on the river, and that decreased biodiversity. It actually, by getting rid of a lot of the plants, the root systems in the banks kind of allowed the banks to collapse by not having the roots there. So these meandering rivers started collapsing the banks and becoming wider and becoming straighter and flowing more in a straight line. So it didn't allow for certain amphibians to necessarily build nests in there because the water currents increased. It changed the biodiversity of the aquatic plants by having that rushing water. It also, not having trees around, it removed nesting sites for birds. It removed a food source for beavers. And if the beavers are gone, then they're the ones that are damming up the river to kind of slow it down. But if they don't have any food because the trees are disappearing, then they move out of the area. And this, again, it's this whole cascade of effects that basically led to a very low biodiversity in the system. And then in light of this, they released wolves later, many decades later. And what happened when they released wolves in this area?
In short, biodiversity increased overall.
Yeah, essentially it just reversed everything that we talked about, right? The elk, their behavior changed. It pushed them back into the more dense forested area where it was safer for them. And it allowed the vegetation to replenish along the river, and that drew in more species, including the beaver came back. The rivers actually kind of changed shape again. They got dammed up and created more wetlands around there, smaller actual rivers, and that creates more pockets of habitat, so more niches for different types of organisms to come in and basically, again, just really increase the biodiversity in the area. So somebody in the chat asked if aren't the wolves being hunted again? I know their numbers are low. Yes, they are opening wolf hunts in multiple states. They already have, and they're going back and forth depending on the population. And this is not related to the class. This is my just general understanding of the topic. So there's a little side tangent for information to answer that. Is some form of the Department of Natural Resources in each state that has wolves wants a wolf population to be at a certain number. Let's say it's 300 or 400. If it exceeds that, they're going to say that it's going to exceed its carrying capacity for what they want. They're going to open hunts to lower those numbers. There are people that are illegally shooting the wolves without hunting tags because, again, they don't like them, they fear them. The wolves do kill livestock and pets sometimes, so they are a nuisance to them. So there is this clash of living together with another top predator. So yes, they are in certain places, they've overhunted the wolves again, and they're going to stop the hunting to allow their numbers to kind of come back up. And they also have to play the game of what is the food population. And a lot of times that's deer and elk. And if you have a really good hunting season that lowers the deer population, that's going to impact the wolves, and vice versa. If the wolves blow up their population, it impact hunting because hunting brings in money, right? So there's kind of this balancing act that a lot of the game wardens and Department of Natural Resources and scientists have to play to allow and stop wolf hunting over time.
The second part of number 10 on the learning objectives is that aquatic ecosystems have higher, or they have more trophic levels is the main reason for that, because more of their primary producers are consumable. I guess a higher percentage of their primary producers are consumable.
Yes, that's
That-
absolutely correct. Can you
Okay.
or someone else explain why that is correct a little bit more? Why are aquatic organisms more consumable than terrestrial organisms? And what does that even mean?
It's just their size.
Some of it's related to size. So someone said and reproduce quickly. So which ones are bigger and which ones reproduce quickly?
Like is it like the phytoplankton or in the zooplankton and the little this I'm not sure, I guess.
Yeah, so if you're getting at which ones reproduce quickly, you know, the algae, the phytoplankton,
Oh,
the
algae, yeah.
zooplankton, those are all aquatic. They're all really small. They all reproduce really quickly. But we think we use the word consumable earlier. What is that? What are we referring to when we say that?
Just because the fish can eat the entire unit, whereas like you can't graze on the bark of a tree or tree trunks. You can only graze on the leaves.
Yeah, so by consumable, I think what we're getting at is digestible, absorbable, palatable, right? So with these small algae and phytoplankton, this gets into the energy efficiencies, right? You can absorb or assimilate nearly 100%. So maybe 90, 95% of algae you can actually absorb in some of these aquatic systems. So there's very little loss of energy. So it's only losing 5 or 10% going from one trophic level to the next and to the next. So the less energy that you lose by going between these trophic levels, the longer these trophic levels can actually be. Versus in terrestrial plants, they produce a lot of the energy of a plant is actually in defenses. So thorns, vines, poisons, bad smells, bad taste, so chemicals in the plants, they produce a lot of that is their biomass and their energy. So less of terrestrial plants are consumable. So maybe the energy efficiency is only like 50 to 60%. So they lose like almost 40% going from the primary producer to the like primary consumer. And the more energy you lose in between these trophic levels, the shorter they're going to be. So that's why aquatic systems are more efficient and usually have longer or more trophic levels than terrestrial.
Okay, thank you.
If it's not too much, I would love so much if we could go through some of those cycle charts the nutrient cycling charts in the activities and maybe work through one or two of those together?
Sure. So we did do one of the carbon cycles.
I think the image is what I'm referring to, where it goes over the whole cycle and you're supposed to like label the image.
Oh, okay, so this, maybe, what is it, how carbon cycles, I think maybe would be.
And then that way we could kind of hear you talk about the entire cycle. I think it's the first activity under each.
Yes, I think. So are you talking about like this activity?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So it is good to know these in a general conceptual sense. But I will also say that you won't see the entire cycle on the exam question. It'll be more geared towards the other types of activities where you match what's happening, but we can definitely go through this because you might get some conceptual questions about this. So what is this one? It starts with fossil fuels lock carbon out of the carbon cycle. So where would we say this one would go? We've got some fossil fuel that looks like coal and oil over in this general direction.
So that's it, forming it underground, right?
Yes. So yeah, so this is definitely taking place completely underground, and the fossil fuels are removing the carbon essentially out of the carbon cycle. So it's being converted into different fuels, so into gas, oil, and coal. And essentially it stops the carbon cycle because they get locked into whatever final product that they're used for. But what about this next one, ocean photosynthesis and respiration?
I guess that's that one in the center, right?
This one up
Just
here.
because it says oceanic. But that's what you were talking about before about the gas exchange with the water exchange.
Yeah, so photosynthesis is a gas exchange to create fuel in plants, right? Exactly. And then respiration is also a form of gas exchange. So it's the two gases for photosynthesis and respiration that are happening between the atmosphere and the ocean. So this one says burning fossil fuels releases carbon.
That one's easy. That's over the factory. I live in Houston, so that one is my.
Yeah, right. So we had our fossil fuels that were created to kind of lock and end that carbon cycle. And then depending on what, if it's coal burning, oil burning, or gas burning, you just burn that fossil fuel. And now it's going to unlock that carbon into the atmosphere and allow it to start that carbon cycle over essentially. So this is the start. And if we go back here, we can say this is the end of the carbon cycle. And then we can say dead marine life becomes sediment. So we kind of talked about that, right? Where it kind of things tend to fall to the bottom of the ocean and get locked in and become sediment. So if it's marine life, it's going to be in the water. If it dies, it's either going to most times sink to the bottom. Occasionally it might get washed up on shore, but it's still going to be on the floor level, whether that's on the banks or all the way to the bottom or some level of the bottom of the ocean. And then this one, storage in land plants. So that's going to be over here, right? Where photosynthesis is going to draw in carbon. And it's going to be stored temporarily in these plants. And how could it be released from these plants?
That was consumption of the organic material they produce, right?
Yeah, so yes, that's a great example. So it could be through fruits that they produce, or the leaves that are eaten, right? Or the tree itself. It could also be released, right? If we should have images over here, if we burn that tree, then it's going to release carbon back into the environment as well. If the trees die and become dead marine, or it would be dead marine life, but it would be dead forest life. But similar idea to here, if they die, they also are going to release carbon back into that environment. So that, there's at least 3 main ways that they can release the carbon after they store it for a temporary period of time. And this last one is carbon enters soil via organic matter. So what does that mean?
That's fecal matter and decomposition, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the animal can put carbon back into the soil via waste, or it could die and it can decompose and put it into the soil as well.
Thank you. That was very helpful. This chart really makes me feel like it's like more cyclical, but hearing you describe it makes me realize there are multiple paths. So that helps quite a bit. Thank you.
No problem.
Perhaps this is more detail than you're able to give, but are we going to need to recall specific hotspots, or are we just going to kind of need to know the general concept of what a hotspot is and how it can be classified?
The second part, definitely noted in a general sense. As far as specifics, I know it does have like a list. I would say focus on the extremes.
Okay.
So are you getting
Like
that?
the global trends, you mean, rather than specific regions?
Global trends for sure, but are you talking about in relation to like biodiversity or?
I just mean that we were given like a little list of a few hotspots and like a map of hotspot areas indicated, and I didn't know if we were going to need to know, like, remember those.
So I want to ask you geographic, like on a map, but maybe like when I mean extremes, what type of places I would ask, like maybe has the most biodiversity, or what types of places has the least biodiversity, and how would we think of maybe answering those? What would we argue are places with some of the most biodiversity?
Okay. So then that would be like coastal regions or tropical regions rather than temperate regions, and be able to explain that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, focus on the extremes of the two. You don't have to know like I think there's probably like in the list like 10-ish things they list. You won't have to recall all of them. Like in order, you won't have to know like 1 through 10 is what I'm kind of getting at, but knowing
Okay.
what 1 versus 10 would be helpful.
Thank you. Cogbooks was very detailed on that, which was very interesting, but I wasn't sure how much we needed to know.
No, and that's a good question because yeah, they did provide a lot of information and comparative stuff, so. I'll say one thing we haven't, I don't think, touched on yet is really succession. So why don't we talk about that maybe for the next few minutes? How would we define succession?
Changes in the composition of an ecosystem over time, like pioneers versus the climax species.
So a change in species composition over time, right? We'd have like species maybe A and B in the beginning, B, C, and D in the middle, and then maybe D, E, and F or something like that towards the end.
Yeah.
Okay. How would a plot of the number of species over time related succession kind of look? Would it be a straight like linear line? Would it be like a bell curve where it goes up and down? Would it be a curve that kind of goes up and plateaus? Or would it be a negative curve? So we had number of species, say, on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. How would the number of species change over time, generally during succession? We start at like the very beginning.
So it would go up initially like a bell curve and then plateau for a little bit and then maybe even drop a little bit, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? There's a plot in Cogbooks that shows that, and it starts with a positive increase because obviously when you start over in a new area from the very beginning of succession, you have very few species. But then as the landscape kind of changes a little bit and you would get more and more species kind of attracted to that area, different species come in, and then you have that initial growth. It kind of plateaus, you could say, around the carrying capacity for that environment, and it's probably going to exceed it a little bit. And then as it gets into the late stage succession, it's going to drop in biodiversity because late stage succession is not, best for all species. So the early and mid stage species might kind of die out or migrate out of the area. And if we're talking about early versus late succession type species, we'll also call them pioneer for early succession and climax for late succession. How would we describe in terms of plants? Because this is a part that Cogbooks kind of covered heavily, early succession species. So what kind of like morphological or physical traits would these early succession pioneer species of plants have? So someone said easily dispersible. Yeah, they're seeds. I would agree with that. What type of what mode of dispersal do these typically have?
Frequently they use wind, right?
Yeah, so a tree that has a lot of small ones that can easily get blown in the wind, or they're really small. Sometimes they have like stickers on them, so they get stuck in animal fur, so they can get transported by animals that way. They very light, very easy to detach from the plant. They're generally right. There's a lot of them, and they're pretty small. We mentioned. What's their growth rate like? They fast, medium, or slow growth?
Fast.
Yeah, so right, they're generally fast growth, right? So there's that table in Cogbooks, and that's kind of what I'm building this off of, that has the different traits of these different plants, and they compare early succession versus late succession. So knowing what the different traits are and how they vary, and being able to maybe compare and contrast them would be helpful too, I think, for this exam.
Do we have time to go over the mechanisms of succession? Like the facilitation, inhibition, and tolerance?
Yeah, I think that's a good one to go over too. All right, so what are the main mechanisms of succession? I think you just listed them off, but let's do it again. Right, so I think we have facilitation was one, inhibition, and tolerance. So there's the three main mechanisms that we had in cogbooks. What does facilitation consist of? We kind of break down the name a little bit. Facilitation, facilitate. Go ahead.
That's like where one species almost colloquially paves the way for the other species, right? Provides the opportunity for the other species to be there.
Yeah, so exactly, it increases the probability of other species coming in. How might a species do that? What would be maybe an example?
Providing like a food source, maybe. If plants were to grow as like the pioneer species, then it could provide a food source for like birds or some other species that would forage on that.
Yeah, so what type of relationships would we maybe say get created or are used in these species during facilitation?
That would depend on, so I guess either mutualistic or predation if the species coming in is the predator.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one, like some of the examples from cogbooks using the elder shrubs, they talk about that they live in a mutualistic relationship with many species. So likely there's going to be several types of mutualisms, like in the example you used, where it could be a food source of some sort or a shelter. I mean, those are great examples of how, we talked about, the previous exam, biodiversity is increased through mutualisms. So I think this is, talks about it in a little bit more detail, how facilitation can work. What about inhibition?
So that's when one species prevents another species.
Yeah, so
The
essentially
super competitive
opposite.
plants, right, that will grow really tall and then shade out the non-competitive plants.
Yeah, so I would describe this as be a lot more instances of competition, right? So as you said, like plants that grow fast and shade out other ones. Some plants, they use chemical warfare a little bit, where they release pheromones or release toxins essentially that kill anything near it. Makes the soil really acidic, so that only there's going to be open space for their seeds when they fall to land and reproduce and just be kind of more stick with a single species. So they prevent other species from coming in and also coexisting in this habitat. And then the last one that it talked about is tolerance. They describe that as a mechanism of succession as well. How did they describe it?
Sorry, my video cut out. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So the last mechanism that they describe is tolerance. And how do they describe that as a mechanism of succession?
So the way I understood that one was it had to do with like how harsh the environment is, right? And then the pioneer species are more tolerant of harsh environments. Is that correct?
Yes, those are both correct. Yeah, so it's kind of a probability mechanism, depending on, like you said, how tolerant they are, essentially what the condition of the environment is. And the second part would be how easily their seeds or offspring are able to disperse.
Okay, so that includes dispersal as well,
Mhm.
dispersal factor.
Yes.
Marvelous, thank you.
Well,
And at the risk of bringing up a sore subject, is there a deadline for when grades are due that we can expect our final grade to be in the system? Is that gonna be like Monday or?
yeah, grades are technically due by end of Monday,
Okay,
so. And I think, I've sat on it for a little bit and obviously kind of thought about it. I think maybe a compromise is to leave it open both days. So you could take it on Thursday or Friday. And I'll make a course announcement about that. So if some people want to take it early, and I will inform the TAs this, they can start grading as soon as they come in, so it won't be necessarily all dumped at one time, but you guys brought up some good points, and I had a chance to think about it for a few minutes, so I think that's fair, considering that grading has been slow this semester.
I know I'm excited to get the class over with, so I'll take it Thursday regardless. So I think that it probably will filter in on the TAs, which might be okay.
Yeah, and also I will say, I appreciate that, but don't anybody feel obligated or pressured to, because if it is Friday, you can take it whenever you're comfortable with it. So if you want to switch to Friday, that is fine.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, as like I said, I think you guys brought up some good points, so it seems reasonable. And I guess maybe one last part of succession that we didn't quite get to is if we talk about it, monitoring succession or measuring succession or testing it in research, what are some kind of more experimental or, well, I guess how do we determine succession? Let's start there. There's a couple ways that scientists can determine it.
I know the book or the cog books talked extensively about that glacier bay and measuring the biomass of the plants, right? Or the type of plants that were in different areas.
Yeah, so kind of they measured them in a linear line of near and far, depending on which direction the glacier went. So they measured them as the glacier receded. They kind of followed that glacier because that had opening for more periods of time. So you can do observational studies where you look, say another way to do it is a volcanic eruption, right? That destroys all the biodiversity in an area and basically starts it over. So you can just observe succession in real time, like a volcano. You can look at historical succession, such as the glacial retreat. How would you do a manipulative study of succession? There are, I think, at least two ways that cogbooks talked about it. So how would you kind of force succession in an experiment? And then monitor it?
I honestly don't recall those examples.
So one was with the barnacles, I think the study, they're the intertidal communities. Yeah, so with the mussels, where they actually had a community and then they just did various ways where they pulled community members out, maybe entire populations or change the size of the populations, and then they just observed how it would change. Did the succession change? Is there competition that is now removed? Is there a predator removed? Does removing one species drive the community to maybe extinction or lower biodiversity? So just kind of the ways they manipulated it. And then the other one was they planted spruce trees and seedlings in 4 cereal stages. So they just planted them at kind of different ages and watched how the community responded to plants coming in at different stages. And if it reset succession, if it moved it forward, if it moved it backward. So you can do removal studies, planting studies, or observational studies.
If we're gonna hang out here for a little while, I certainly wouldn't mind you going over one of the efficiency equations. If we could just like work through an example on there. I assume we'll have to like interpret just like in the activity, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good topic to cover. I think
Also, one thing that I would love to hear you explain, just see if you can do a better job than the cogbooks, is why the biomass pyramid is reversed for aquatic.
sure.
You know
Yeah,
what I'm
cover
referring
that too.
to?
So I think it has to do with size of the organisms, but we can get into that after we go through one of the efficiencies.
Okay, only if we have time.
Yeah, no, I'm good. As long as people want to stay on. Okay. So we can see the table here, right?
Yes, for
Okay. So what we have is we have a table of which energy it is. So, and it's the different ones, right? The net production available, consumed energy, assimilated energy, and the net production energy. And then in this example, it gives us 3 different environments that we can make calculations for, right? Terrestrial, lake, and stream. And then it just, what it does is the example goes through in order, and then you notice the ecological efficiency uses some of the previous calculations that we have to kind of build to. So for the exam, what you would see is something very much like this, where you're going to get a table. It's going to have your different energy efficiencies or different energy levels here on the side in joules. And then it might have 1, it might have 2 or 3, depending on the size of the table. And then it could ask something as simple as, what is the consumption efficiency for the terrestrial ecosystem? And knowing what that equation is, and that this is where, I recommend putting these on the note card. If you have this equation, you know that it's consumed energy. So you can find that up here. For terrestrial, it would be the 250. And then the net production energy of the next lower trophic level. So this is the lower trophic level here, and that's 1000. So that's why it would be 250 over 1000 equals 0.25 or 25%. If you write it as a decimal or a percentage, I'm not gonna be too picky on the exam. Odds are you might see this in a multiple choice. So you pick if it's 25 or 0.25, and that will show that you understood the math. And I didn't do it as a trick question. Like I don't have a 0.25 and a 25. It would be, like a 35 or a 0.25. So try to keep it straightforward. But you could be asked, the same question. You could be asked, what is the assimilation efficiency? So then you would look at the equation. It's assimilated energy over consumed energy. And if it's for again, for this example, we're just using the terrestrial ecosystem. So assimilated energy would be from this box right here. So that's where the 120 comes from. And then consumed energy is 250. So you have your 120 over 250. And if we ask maybe, you know, what is the assimilation efficiency and what does that mean? What does this 48% mean?
Of the consumed energy, how much of it was assimilated versus used for, what is it, respiration and reproduction?
Well, if it's used for reproduction, it's likely
Is that
that
assimilated?
yeah, because usually you have to what do we mean by assimilate first? Let's back up there.
It's put into the organism, right?
Yeah, so essentially you absorb it, right? You say you eat a sandwich and it's worth 100 joules. You swallow, or the consumed energy that you swallowed is going to be 100 in that case for us. And then you absorbed half of that sandwich. So then you absorb 50 joules, and then your waste is going to be 50 joules. And that can come out, you know, in urine, feces, respiration. So that's ways that you're going to lose some of that energy. You can't absorb everything necessarily that, you know, an organism ingests. And why is that? Why don't we assimilate at 100%? And by we, I mean any organism.
Like not everything is necessarily digestible, right? Like the lignins, is that how you say that from the decomposition chapter?
Yeah.
And the cellulose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. Not everything is digestible. You know, I'm sure, you know, as humans, we've eaten certain vegetables and we've seen them the next day in our waste, right? We didn't digest it. So it just passed through our system, but that's energy we took in, and that's energy that we didn't absorb and we lost it. And also some of it is plants invest, and we talked about this a little bit with the trophic levels. Some plants invest in defenses. So it's not, you know, thorns or bark is not really digestible, but, you know, to get there, sometimes you eat it with the other digestible plants. Yeah, so we get the assimilation efficiency is 48% of a meal was absorbed by that organism, and then it can take that energy that it absorbed and it can transfer it to growth, reproduction, repair, or whatnot, whatever internal physiological processes, you know, thermoregulation, anything essentially can transfer that energy to where it's needed.
Okay, I don't know why I wasn't including reproduction in assimilation. Thank you.
No worries. I don't think Cogbooks broke it down that detailed, but you know, I think, you know, we have a conversation. I think it helps the understanding of, you know, what these things are. And then kind of just
For
going
sure. The math is a little bit easy, but the concepts, it really helps to hear you just kind of talk them out.
Good. I'm glad this can be helpful. Yeah, so I agree. The math should be pretty straightforward, at least for these like first four, because it's just finding the number that associates with the equation and, you know, plugging it in. So again, if we just go down the list, the net production efficiency, that says net production efficiency. Right there, you know, the same words, it's going to be 50 over assimilated energy. And then assimilated energy is 120. So 50 over 120 is 42%. And even here, for ecological efficiency, that's net production energy of a trophic level divided by the net production energy of the next lower trophic level. So these are in the table, but this is just knowing which one is associated with which. So we talk about our net production of a trophic level, and this one is the lower trophic level. So this one is the lowest trophic level because it's the net production available from the primary producers. So that's going to be our 1000 on the bottom. And the net production of the next trophic level is going to be this one, the net production of energy of the 50, and that's 5%. So would we say that ecological efficiency of this terrestrial ecosystem is high or low?
I guess if we're using the rule of thumb, which is 10%, right? It's low.
Yeah, so what it is low, I would agree with that. And how would we describe like what this 5% means? In like one or maybe two sentences.
That's probably where I struggle on the details. I would say that it is the overall efficiency of energy transfer from one trophic level to the next.
Yeah,
But
think
I don't
that's
know if that's
I think
correct.
that's a great explanation. So how much of this like 1,000 from the primary producers essentially gets put into the next highest or the next trophic level? So only 5% of that energy is moved up, right? That's not a lot. Because then there's only 5% to go into the next level. So there's likely only going to be maybe one more level after this in this terrestrial ecosystem. If we had 50% left, then we could probably get a couple more trophic levels.
And just to clarify, so I really understand what's going on here, this is like one trophic level change that we're calculating, right? It's not for an overall system. We're just calculating the change between one level.
Yeah, you could have net production energy. You could have this table like doubled or tripled, and it'll walk you through more trophic levels. Yeah, this
Okay.
is just from beginning from primary producers to the next trophic level, which would be
Okay,
primary
that helps a lot.
consumers.
For some reason, I was thinking it was like I was confused, but that helps a lot. Thank. And I imagine this is a place where our note card would really come in handy. So for example, we could put on our note card the entire equation written second line from the bottom: ecology, efficiency, net production energy of a trophic level over. So that whole
Yep.
thing could be on our note card. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I would recommend putting, I can't highlight it, I guess, but this consumption efficiency, like this entire wording could be put on there. Like basically here, every other line, right? We don't need the numbers in here because they're from an example, but like for assimilation efficiency equals assimilated energy in joules over consumed energy joules. Like, yeah, I would recommend putting that on there. If you want to abbreviate it for room and you understand what it means, great. If you want to put all the words for the equation on there also, great. And you can do the same thing for the ecological efficiency. All of this text can, I encourage to go on there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that way it's not memorizing the math, but you can prove you can do the math and then conceptually describe what the results are.
And then if we do still have time, the inverse pyramid, which was the second part of my question.
Yep, no problem. That's exactly what I'm looking for right now.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay.
If it's helpful, it's T20. Oh, you found it.
Yep, but I appreciate it because it was taking me a second to scroll through them. So this is what you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay, so these two top triangles, this is energy pyramid and biomass pyramid for terrestrial ecosystems, and these two match each other. And what they're saying is in a terrestrial ecosystem of energy and biomass, they have similar shapes because most of the energy is standing biomass is in the producers. So this is going to be the standing biomass is going to be like plants, right? We have tons of forest, tons of grass compared to terrestrial organisms that eat them, such as deer, moose, or whatnot. So essentially, there's just more physical producers than there are consumers. And in aquatic systems, it's the opposite. The producers, because they have short lives and there's rapid consumption, right here is kind of the key results in a larger biomass of consumers. So the algae are there, but they die very rapidly and they're consumed very rapidly, that the biomass is actually highest in your tertiary consumers. So there's more biomass of whale than and other consumers like that than there are going to be of the lower level producers. And the reason they don't run out of these producers is because they can reproduce so quickly. They just get consumed almost as rapidly as they get produced.
Okay, would it be safe to relate this back to another concept you were talking about earlier, where a lot of tertiary producers have biomass that is like defense mechanisms, and so perhaps that's maybe why they have more biomass than aquatic producers?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's definitely a good point.
Okay, because for some reason I was
And I think that's
confused
why,
on this pyramid.
and that's a little bit why they're generally smaller, is because they don't have the excess, mass that is used for defense. So we're comparing, phytoplankton and algae to trees. There's obviously much difference in their actual biomass.
That helps, thank you.
Are there any other specific topics or things we want to cover? I think we covered most of the general material in the topics and learning materials as well. Maybe number 5, we didn't go over this part of hotspots explicitly. It says explain how scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity. So there's 3 main ways that I pulled out of cogbooks that they identify hotspots of biodiversity. So why don't we maybe quickly list those? What are they looking for in the areas? One of them was finding areas with high numbers of endemic species. That means species that are local to the area or only found in certain regions. So maybe a species of insect or plant is only found on certain island chains. So they're endemic to the area. Yeah, by biodiversity, we're part of it is species richness from the chat. That is correct.
One of them was like potential threat from human, how I phrased it was contamination, right?
Yeah, so they're looking at areas that are facing projected threats of extinction. And then I think this from the chat, I think maybe what you're getting with species richness is part of that is that they're looking at areas that have high species richness without a focus on endemic species. So it could include some invasive species or migrating species. Yeah, so that would be the third way that cogbooks describe that scientists identify hotspots for biodiversity. You can kind of either focus on areas that doesn't have a lot of migration or focus on areas that currently have biodiversity and focus on protecting them so they don't lose their biodiversity. Is there anything else that anybody want to go over?
What we talked about earlier, that the pie charts for T22, are we gonna be given those pie charts? Or are we gonna need to recall the specific animal groups? Like, and whether or not they're threatened or not?
You will have questions that will give you those pie charts.
Okay, they'll give us the pie charts though to reference, and then like make an interpretation of those charts.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, you'll be asked a question about the charts that you're also given.
Okay, but we won't need to recall the numbers just off the top of our head.
No. Yeah,
Okay,
you-
marvelous.
Yeah, that's the pretty straight memorization, which is, I don't think the greatest, so.
I would agree, so thank you.
I guess I didn't want to be lumped in with anybody giving negative feedback. I wanted to offer some positive feedback to you. I really have enjoyed the course. I know the layout wasn't too much in your hands, but I thought I navigated it just fine, and I really have enjoyed your office hours. They've always been really helpful. And then my TA, I had a great experience with. He provided really good feedback, and I don't know if all the TAs did this, but he even emailed all of us specifically stating what he would be looking for and what we should, just some advice on how we should go about the short answer questions. So just wanted to put some positive feedback out there for you.
All right, I appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate that, so thank you, and I do acknowledge like that there is some shortcomings with the course, and there are some changes that we discussed, I think, and some of the feedback was, helpful. I think me being able to share that with the course designers and creators, hopefully could be helpful too, so.
If I could also agree with that the weekly office hours have been incredibly helpful. I'm sure your hands are tied on what you can specifically help us with, but just having the regular session of you explaining things, very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good to hear that people are benefiting from it.
Yeah, some professors don't do office hours at all, and I find it really difficult when I don't hear verbally from the professor describe the material. So thank you for that.
Oh. And I appreciate, the class as well, your patience through some of the struggles, especially early on in the course. So I think we're almost there. One more exam, we'll make it through. Okay, but if there's no other questions, I think we did a good job of covering stuff again, unless there's, one last question. I think I'll go ahead and we end the session. I'll be available through email still, through, for Friday, and I'll be available after the course as well, but just up to the exam. And then your exam grade should come out early next week, or your final grade should come out early next week. Hopefully Monday, Tuesday at the latest. And if you have questions about that, there's still a little bit of wiggle room, but make sure to ask your questions quickly. His final grades are due to the university. And it's a little more difficult to change grades once they've gone into the system. Not impossible, but it might just take a little bit more time and effort. All right, well, thank you, and I will go ahead and be working on getting these uploaded.